I'd like to take you back for an opening story to a time in yesteryear, even further back than the Lone Ranger. Way back, in the Wayback Machine, to the year 386 A.D., in a town called Antioch in the Middle East, the same Antioch that you read about in the book of Acts, where there was a vibrant church that gave its start to the Apostle Paul and his travels, his missionary journeys. A lot of time had passed from the time of Paul and Barnabas and those elders. In the year 386 A.D., about 400 years later, other things were taking place. And the church that was the church, the Christian church at that time, was no longer likely meeting on the Sabbath day, Saturday, seventh day, but it was a Sunday at about this time of year that its pastor got into the pulpit and looked out over his congregation, much as I'm looking out over you today. The man's name was John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom. You don't have to remember that. There won't be a test on that unless you're an ABC this year. We'll just call him John C. He had a reputation. He was a fiery speaker. They called him, I believe they called him Golden Voice. He was just a master of oratory. On this particular week, he gave a blistering sermon to his congregation. And at a certain point, from the record that we have in history that has come down to us, he looked his audience in the eye, and as only certain ministers can do, gave him the look. And he probably knew who he was talking to. And he singled them out. They couldn't hide. And he said this: "The festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to march upon us, one after the other, and in quick succession. The Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, the fast, i.e., Day of Atonement." He went on, "There are some in our ranks who say they think as we do. Yet some of these are joined to keep the festivals, and others will join the Jews in keeping their feast and observing their fast." And then I can imagine that he probably paused and looked out and into the eyes of exactly those maybe sitting in a particular section of his church who were of this particular bent. That is, they were going to meet with Jews and keep the fall festivals. And he said this last statement: "I wish to drive this custom from the church right now. I wish to drive this custom from the church right now." This was the year 386. And let me tell you why this is an interesting year. It's really a remarkable testimony. It's certainly a very powerful sermon, and it would not be one you and I would want to hear from anyone speaking to us on a Sabbath day, although a few years ago we kind of heard certain sermons and ideas quite like that, even in our own time, about 19 years ago. But this goes back several centuries. But it's remarkable in this way, because at this late date, by comparison to the time of Jesus Christ, the apostles, and the New Testament church we read of in the New Testament, there are still people who are Christians, calling themselves Christians, keeping the holy days. Now, the irony is this sermon was given very likely, almost positively, on a Sunday. The church by that time had already abandoned the Sabbath day. But there were still people who were keeping the holy days in some form or fashion. For the minister to get up and to say what he did and to have that recorded and even to survive the times and come down to us today, it's a remarkable testimony. Just 5 years earlier, there had been a major church council called the Council of Constantinople. And that was a very important church council because what it did was it locked in for evermore forward the doctrine of the Trinity and the approach toward Christ and the Father, and especially the Holy Spirit, that it was the great triune God. And there was something else, because the emperor at that time backed it 200%. Church officials now had the authority of the state behind them to enforce Orthodox teaching, not only on the Trinity, but anything else that they wanted in their Christian churches. And they began to do so. And they locked the door on anyone who didn't believe the Trinity. And as you can see from a sermon like this, they were going to lock the door on anyone who would dare to keep the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, or the Feast of Tabernacles, and still try to fellowship with them in a spirit of love and peace. It couldn't coexist. And this man and his church had the power of the state behind them to make it happen. But I find it actually a testimony of faith, and a positive testimony. I've studied this subject in that period of time quite a bit, and knowing how quickly the truth fled from the church 200 years earlier, 250 years earlier, soon after the death of John and the original apostles, to find this being in the 4th century, to still find this being done is amazing. Now, it didn't last long, because indeed, John C. and his cohorts, they did crush it out of the church. And it virtually, any further references to the holy days or truths that we might hold dear, such as even the millennium, begin to disappear from history as we have it. In fact, we go a few decades later into the 5th century, and there's actually, I found one reference to a church that still believes in the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. You know where that church is, according to the history? It's in a little town called Laodicea. Next time you want to get down on the Laodiceans, think twice. Some of them in that church, in that city, as late as the 5th century, still held to one thread of truth, the idea that Christ was going to reign on this earth for 1,000 years. Now, they had a lot of other things wrong. It's a testimony, certainly, to the truth of God and how powerful it is and how lasting and enduring it is. And God has always kept a remnant alive, and the truth has never died out, as small as it may have become among small groups of people who have held to the Sabbath, non-Trinitarian teaching, maybe even fragments of the holy days. It's always been there. You can trace elements of it and see it through history. What we are a part of in our time and in our period in the church is truly an anomaly since the 1st century. We should always remember that. You know what happened to these people that John C. spoke to that day? I don't know. Did they fold to the pressure immediately? Did they not want to be associated with the Jews, and did they find themselves there then on Easter Sunday and whatever else was being done, and forget any idea of keeping a Passover on the 14th day? I don't know. Did they stick to their belief, and did they put God first? Here's the real question: did they fear God more than man? I don't know. History doesn't tell us that. But it was a perilous period for spiritual truth. And the last vestiges of the faith that had been once delivered was being hunted down and exterminated by a very powerful church-state combination called the Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, my sermon today is not meant to drive you away from the holy days. Rather, it's meant to lead you to God through our observance of the holy days. But I start with that just to show a little bit of the challenges through the centuries that anyone who has wanted to hold on to any part of truth has had to face. We're very fortunate in that we don't have such a situation today where our doctrines and faith may have been challenged in past. We have had the freedom and the means to reorganize and to keep it alive and to worship God as we see from Scripture. And we will continue to do so. We will not let that be ripped from us in any way, shape, or form. But what I want to do today is to lead you to a key spiritual lesson to learn from these upcoming holy days about God as we begin to keep the holy days. We've just 2 days ago kept the Feast of Trumpets. We'll be keeping atonement, as Mr. Myers mentioned here, and others of the people of God will be doing so next Sabbath, and then we're off to the Feast of Tabernacles, and all the conversations are abuzz around church right now is, where are you going? When are you leaving? What are you going to do? And that's dominating our conversation, and rightly so. It's a wonderful time for the people of God, a wonderful time for the church as we begin to keep the fall festivals. Trumpets is always a big high. We were over in Indianapolis 2 days ago and kept it with the brethren over there, and it was not only good to be home to our former home and see our kids and family and old friends, but just to keep the feast again and to get to the holy day season now. And so we're into it. And it's on our mind, and it's certainly in our heart. But it's also important that we refresh our mind as to their significance, their importance, and understand why they are so important to God's people, not only in past history, but obviously for us today as we are living it, breathing it, writing our own epic of history in the story of the Church of God. The festivals are symbols of very deep spiritual truths that God wants us to keep front and center in our minds each year as we begin to walk through the meaning of the festivals. They teach us, number one, who God is. They teach us who God is, the true God, and His Son, Jesus Christ. As Christ prayed in John 17 and verse 3, He said, "This is eternal life, that they might know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent." And everything about the holy days points us to Jesus Christ and to God the Father. Because you can't speak of Christ, as Christ Himself told us, without coming to the Father. He is the way by which we come to the Father. None can come to the Father except through me, He said. And so every time we speak of Christ, we're speaking to the Father and about the Father and of the Father, because they're one. But these days teach us the true God, which is the first commandment, really, when you stop and think about it. To understand the true God strikes at the very first commandment. And the Passover identifies us with the fullness of Jesus Christ, His suffering and His death. Unleavened bread teaches us of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God. We go from the life or the death and the suffering of Jesus Christ on Passover to the fullness of the gospel as we move into the days of unleavened bread. Because as we eat that unleavened bread, we picture the risen Christ in us and the means by which we have a hope of glory as sons of God. That only God can deliver us from the bondage of sin and death and bring us to salvation. When we get to Pentecost, it shows us that we are among the first fruits of creation. That God has a purpose and a plan that He's bringing to pass in phases, and Pentecost teaches us about the first fruits. That this today is not the only day of salvation, and that we are among a group of people of whom Christ is the first, a group called the first fruits. And that lays a very great responsibility upon us, because we are now under a time of judgment. And now's the time of our calling. And that's the message in part that we obtain from the Feast of Pentecost. The festivals help us to understand the flow of prophecy. Christ is going to return at the seventh trumpet. The Feast of Trumpets teaches us that. We know, and we can even look to the sequence of events from the book of Revelation. We know that from 1 Thessalonians of the blowing of that trumpet will also be the time of the first resurrection. And Christ's return will signal many events at that particular point in time. And then prophecy is going to open up in terms of an end time. The end time events will begin to just really get going. We sometimes think of end time events and the study of end time events, and we look at, from where we are right now to events and personalities of a rise of 10 kings and of another revival of a bestial system and 2 witnesses and a false prophet. And we tend to think that that's only the end times that we should be concerned about. Oh no. Oh no. That's just the rough shoals of passage to get to the really big times of end times. Because with Christ's return, then the end times do really begin to roll at that point. And the new creation begins to be created with that 1,000-year reign, as Christ reigns with the saints for that period of time in preparation for another event. And ultimately, a new creation completely when Christ hands the kingdom up to the Father. The study of end times moves way beyond just the point at which Christ returns. And so we have to keep it all in a proper perspective there. But these festivals help us to do so, on through tabernacles and then to the 8th day. And in fact, a major lesson, when we understand where we are in our places, that we are now called to prepare ourselves for that time of reigning with Jesus Christ for 1,000 years that Revelation 20 and verse 4 teaches us about. That's why we are born. That's why we are called now, to prepare in advance for that period of time. And that this time is a period of preparation. And that all we do in faith, in the faith, all that we do in every aspect of our life, every day, every hour, our lives are wrapped up in preparing for that point in time with Christ's return and afterwards, where we do prepare to reign with Him. We have to use that terminology, and we should not shy away from that, as imperfect as we sometimes get about even ruling our own selves and even collectively among ourselves. The Scripture is still true as to what is Christ's purpose for the church today, to be prepared for that, to prepare saints to reign and rule with Him. And that's why you and I have been called now, in advance of the billions who will be called at a later point. There's a reason, and it's to prepare to reign with Christ and to have a role in that, which means everything we do in our life right now, every decision that we make, every action we take, every word we speak, every plan we bring to fruition should be in line with that great purpose. That takes discipline, that takes overcoming, it takes endurance, and it takes all of the things that we normally talk about in terms of our approach to Christian living, but that's what it is. That's it. And so when we begin to prepare ourselves to keep the Feast of Tabernacles and Atonement and the 8th day, let's keep that in mind as to really what we are to learn from these and what God tells us we should learn. We keep the feast to learn a proper fear and respect of God, a respect and a deep-rooted love that's unbending and unshakable for God. That's why we keep it. After all, that's what He tells us. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 14. Let's go back to this well-known passage, which is always a good starting point for the festivals, and typically a lot of times during even the fall festival here. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, let's go after certain tithing principles and other matters, foods are related. We come down to tithing principles here in verse 22. Let's begin reading in verse 22. He writes, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God, in the place where He chooses to make His name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil of the firstborn of your herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." And so in this basic agrarian society of the time of Moses and the subsequent conquest and Israel in their period, God lays out through Moses this plan for a society. in which they will worship God and they will keep the festivals. And they are based around the harvest cycle, yes, but there's far more meaning than just the harvest aspects there. We know them as a very deep spiritual meaning. And it's interesting just to look at this. The tithing is talked about, and new grain and oil and wine and herds and flocks, which are means of exchange and wealth that most of us, don't deal in today. Unless you have a few chickens out back or a few head of cattle that you've got, but that's not where you're making your income from. You're going to a job, we're tithing on that, and we're setting that tithe aside for the keeping of the festivals, and that, in a sense, fulfills what the instruction that we see here. What we really have done in our time is take these instructions that were rooted in an agrarian tribal society and adapted them into the modern world as best we can to keep the holy days. And we should all know the story of that, the history of that, even in our own time, but this is what we have done. When you look at what they were told to do here, they were tithing on goats and cows. But when God tells them in verse 24, if the journey is too far, that you're not able to carry the tithe, or the place where the Lord your God chooses to put His name's too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, exchange it for money and take the money in your hand and go to the place which your Lord your God chooses and spend your money there. That's a modern method given by Moses all this time in the ancient world. Really, it's a modern method for them to have done that. But that's what we do as matter of course. We take our money and we don't convert it to animals unless you're in Africa, and they do that literally over there. But we don't. I mean, they literally buy sacks of corn and meal and goats, and they kill the goats and they hang them up. I've seen it, and it's fun. If you like skinned goats with flies on them, but it sure teaches you a few things. Here's what they're told to do is to take this to the place where God has chosen and to spend it on whatever your heart desires, in verse 26, for oxen, sheep, for wine, similar drink, whatever your heart desires, to eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who's within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. This is the classic, basic text that we take, and I began hearing this from my very first Feast of Tabernacles as to why we were there and what we were doing. And I heard it expounded, and I've expounded it hundreds of times, I guess, through the years as a minister. And I go back every year and I look at this and look at it. This is what we are to do. And it's really quite simple in terms of the instruction. Go where God's placed His name. Now, I used to think, when I first came in the church, I thought God had placed His name only in 3 places on this earth: Squaw Valley, California, Big Sandy, Texas, and Jekyll Island. When they added the 4th one about 3 years later, I think it may have been Mount Pocono, I thought, no, there's only 3 places where God has placed His name. And then I realized, you can mix that around based on need and everything else. And as the church grew, we had to have more feast sites in that period of time. And God's placed His name in a lot of places through the years. Sometimes I've been to certain feast sites and I've thought, I don't know that God's got His name here. But true enough, we didn't go back to certain places. Went to Johnson City, Tennessee one time years ago. I went there. A lot of us went there. Johnson City, Tennessee. And don't mean to offend, but kept one feast there. And as my dad used to say, I didn't leave anything behind to have to go back. But the church didn't either. We didn't go back. So some places just don't work out. But, administrative decisions are made. And we go and we keep the feast in these locations. Now, there's 2 things that these verses here that we've read tell us to do. The first one is to fear God. And that means basically to respect God, to look at God with an awe and a wonder and a reverence and a love. It is not to stand in stark, raving fear of God. It is meant to respect and to love God, His teachings, and all that He tells us, and to love the truth, and to love it with all of our heart, might, and being, and to love God with all of our heart, might, and being. And what we do teaches us how to have a proper respect and fear of the Almighty God. So we do it, as he says in verse 23, that we might learn to fear God, the Lord your God, always. And then he says in verse 26, after we do all these things, the wine, the food, spending our money, it is that we might rejoice, us and our household. Fear God and rejoice. Two great principles of keeping all of the festivals. And as we keep the Feast of Tabernacles in a unique way, in a 7-day setting for the feast, and then the 8th day and the travel to and fro and all that becomes obviously the bulk of our attention. And that has been what has been our tradition as we have developed it within the church today. We used to keep the Days of Unleavened Bread for 7 full days in a location, hotels, camping, but that went out sometime in the mid to late 1960s, and we settled by tradition upon just keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. And but that's kind of what we used to do. But because of, again, the modern setting and demands and time and money, we just couldn't do that. So we keep the Feast of Tabernacles in this manner, and it has served the church well, spiritually speaking. It has been a uniting and a bonding factor for the church as we have come along to do this. When I look at these verses every year, as I said, and I think about all my feasts and experiences, and as I said, some places haven't always been that great, but most of them have, and they're wonderful. And I have learned through the years how to rejoice. I've learned how to rejoice at the feast. And he says this in the context of food and fellowship. And the people that we're with, you and your household, the Levite and others that don't have a part or inheritance. So there are people, there's food, there's socials, there's a general feasting, true feasting experience as you keep the feast. And in the early years when I kept it, we camped on the property in Big Sandy, the Ambassador College property in Big Sandy, and what they call the Pine Woods or the Piney Woods. And you could walk up and down the streets and people would feed you. They always had something cooking in their campsites, and you never went hungry. And there's somebody was always playing music, bluegrass usually, and some pickup band that was going on, and fellowship, and up and down, and services. And as those years, the first 7 or 8 years I kept the feast was in that type of a setting. And you rejoice in so many different things. First of all, I rejoiced that I was out of school for 10 days. Until I got back and had to do all the homework over again. When it comes to food, I thought there was a time when, to me, spending my little bit of tithe that I had for what my soul and heart desired, there was no greater joy that I could experience than a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And to this day, I have a memory of my best friend in the church at that time and I, 1968. We were sitting in at that time, he had a motel room in a kind of a less than 3-star setting in Gladewater, Texas. And we went over one afternoon after church to watch the St. Louis Cardinals and the Detroit Tigers play that afternoon in the World Series. And we went and we bought us a bucket of chicken and a 12-pack of frosty root beer. Original recipe. And we ate it all. And I thought, it doesn't get any better than this. Doesn't get any better than this. And I was rejoicing. What's your memory? What's your story? What's in your wallet? Now, as the years went by, I learned that there was more to the feast than Kentucky Fried Chicken. I learned there were good steaks, prime rib, and all of that. And so I've had those, and I've had good cookout, potluck meals at the feast, cookouts on a beach, in a campground, just frankly, eating in a hotel room after a day of traveling and services, and just pulling up everything, sharing with what 3 or 4 of us would have and carrying, and every night just putting it out on the beds in our hotel rooms, and just having a potluck on whatever was available there, chips and cheese and crackers and everything else. I've had good meals, I've had medium meals, I've had not so good meals. And so the food part of it is great, and that's what is there. The other part of what these verses tell us is the fellowship. This is the second element that really makes a good feast, that these verses really speak to, and that's the people you're with. You've got to have a fellowship with your family, with your friends that you go with people that you meet there, that you take in. And when you see someone that may be by themselves, you include them, and you get to know other people in the aisles of services, in the hotels, wherever that you are in the restaurants, and you get acquainted. That's what these verses are describing as well, that make up the feast and the experience and the memories and draw us together. And I've met a lot of people as you have as you've kept the feast. I can think back to a lot of faces, a lot of families, a lot of people that have grown up that I've met in the many years of the feast, and in various locations. You wonder sometimes, where are they? Are they still alive? Are they still in the church? If they're not, what's happened to their life? And you think about these situations as you look back over the years of people. And the best feasts that I've had have largely been around because the people that you get to know and you're with and you become acquainted with as you tell each other stories. That is one thing that I have learned that makes the feast what it does. I've had my romances, my feast romances too. When I was a teenager, Big Sandy, I think it was 2 days before the 8th day, I met this girl, cute little girl. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and we just kind of started talking, and I actually started to sit next to her at services. I hadn't done that before. And when it came to the last song of the last service on the 8th day, we sang "God Be With You Till We Meet Again," and we all had a tear in our eye, and she gave me her address, and I gave her my address, and we said, well, let's write to each other. I thought, wow, there's a girl in the church, nice girl, and good personality. So we started writing letters. This was a long time ago. We wrote letters all through the year. And come the spring, we found out we were going to be at the same feast site the next year, which was going to be the first year at the Lake of the Ozarks. How many of you were at the first year of the Lake of the Ozarks? Anybody here? Okay, I was there. Haven't been back since, but I was there. We were going to be at the feast together. So we planned that. We couldn't wait. Got to the feast, first night. I went through the crowd looking for her. There she was. She saw me. I saw her across the crowded room. How you doing? Good to see you. We kept on going. We didn't talk the rest of the feast. I don't know what happened. It's just like when we saw each other a year later, it just didn't work. And I don't know whatever happened to her. Literally, didn't see her the rest of the feast. Now, there's a story there for all of you young folks, but I'm not going to get into that one today. Feast romances are an interesting situation. Be careful. I've had mine. No, as you know, it was not Debbie. That's another story. Moses is talking about food, fellowship, and faith here, which really are the key ingredients for the best feast ever. Fear of God is nothing more than, again, just faith in God and all that entails. Food, fellowship, and faith is what he's talking about here. And in all my years, no matter how many locations, no matter how exotic, no matter how close to home and not seemingly so special, this year or whatever it might be, the best feasts have always been with these elements, and fellowship and faith the highest, most important. Because this is the formula God gives us in these verses. And when we focus on that and the spiritual dimension that all of them work together to produce, we will have the best feast. And we will learn to fear God, and we will rejoice in the proper spirit. I'd like to go through a passage. I got to thinking, how might we learn this? What story could we learn this? Because my stories of a girlfriend and Kentucky Fried Chicken don't quite measure up to the spiritual dimension that we need to get into in a feast preparation sermon like this. And I remembered one of the stories from the Old Testament that happened during one of the festivals, maybe the Feast of Tabernacles, maybe the spring. And it's back in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2. And it's the story of Samuel, his birth, his mother Hannah. Now, about 3 months ago, I gave a sermon, and I referred to Hannah's story as part of that, one of the points of that sermon. And I was thinking about that when I was putting this together, and I realized, well, yeah, I talked about Hannah, but I didn't talk about chapter 2 of Hannah and her prayer. But let's just rehearse for a minute before we get to chapter 2 and look at the prayer of Hannah, the story. If you look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, just to remember what the setting is. It tells us in, there was a certain man, verse 1. He had 2 wives, verse 2, Hannah and Peninnah, or Peninnah, whatever you want to say. I've never been able to know how to pronounce Peninnah. I guess if you're from Ohio, it's Peninnah. But if you're from Georgia, it's Peninnah. You'd say Peninnah. I don't take a pick. Anyway, Peninnah had kids. Hannah didn't. She wanted a kid. But here's what it says in verse 3. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. Now, Shiloh was where the tabernacle was at that time, long before David ever took it up to Jerusalem. This is where the tribes gathered according to the instruction that we read back in Deuteronomy 3 times in a year. They went to Shiloh. And so what we're being told here is that he went up, Elkanah, with his wives, yearly to the feast. Now, again, it was one of the 3 seasons, Passover, Pentecost, or the fall festivals. It doesn't give us exactly which one. But you remember Hannah was barren. She wanted a child. She prayed for a child and said, I'll give him, Lord, to you if you do. Well, she got pregnant, and Samuel was the result of that. And so if you look then down in verse 21, we find a second occurrence of later, Elkanah and his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. And so Hannah had Samuel, and she did not go, for she said to her husband, not until the child's weaned, then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. She was going to devote him to the Lord. Hannah's example of faith is a remarkable one. And I covered that a few months ago in a sermon in brief, but that kind of sets it up because what I want to focus on here is her prayer, which she began in chapter 2 and verse 1, when she then finally went up to Shiloh and gave over her son. Verse 27 of chapter 1 says she prayed, and God has granted me my petition which I asked. I've lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. And they worshiped the Lord there. And so the setting is in the festival periods when these events took place. And if we look at her prayer, I think that we might learn some things about rejoicing in fear of God, is my point. Here's a prayer of a woman who had given her all, as far as she knew, maybe her only son at that point. She went on to have others. But she promised him to God, and she followed through on it. Hannah was a dedicated, zealous, fine spiritual woman. And it is her prayer that is fascinating to really look at. I think this is a prayer that you and I could study personally for our own benefit at this time of year as we go up yearly to worship the God that we serve in the place where He's placed His name. It's a prayer not unlike Mary's prayer in the New Testament when she found out she was pregnant with Jesus. And, gentlemen, some of the best prayers in the Bible are from women. And we should learn from that. Sometimes when you want a real good spiritual conversation, find a group of women standing around. I mean that the right way. Some of us men get into some good ones too, but Hannah's prayer here is pretty good. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. She says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." Remember, she'd been barren, and she was bitter toward Peninnah because Peninnah had kids, and there was tension there in the family. And now she has the one, and she's giving him up. But she was rejoicing before God. What does God tell us to do when we go to keep the feast? To rejoice before Him and to fear Him. Here's Hannah giving her all in devotion to her God. And she was rejoicing. My horn, which is a symbol of strength, is what that is. That's what her horn means. My horn's exalted. I don't know, did you have a shofar blown here on trumpets? Did somebody try to blow the shofar? Nobody did? Really? You didn't keep the Feast of Trumpets. We had two blowings in Indianapolis. Second one was pretty good. Blasted it. It's not that kind of horn. This is a horn that is a symbol of her strength. And she says, I smile at my enemies. I rejoice in your salvation. So there's kind of three elements: her heart, her strength, and the words of her mouth. The deep feelings of her life, the inner person of Hannah, and her actions that she's able to do, and the words that she speaks, they're all wrapped up and they're devoted toward God. They're centered on God, which is where all of us should be with all of our life. The innermost thoughts that compel us to actions. And as we speak, it should be from that type of heart. Words that build and edify, and that are words of faith and words of encouragement that reflect a God-centered life. This is what she was. No one is holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. Nor is there any rock like our God. She knew that God was supreme, paramount, faithful, and sure. And she was at His place where He had placed His name at a time of year, which was one of the festivals. She was before God, and she was pouring it out in this prayer. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. Feast of Tabernacles is a very good time for any of us to check our pride and how we're doing on pride. Do we talk proudly? Do we act proudly? Do we think proudly? When we go to keep the feast, we have festival tithe. That there's a lot of money to spend in a very short period of time wherever and whatever we do. Connect that with the idea of the harvest being in, and as we read in Deuteronomy, to turn it into money and go where God has placed His name. The harvest time for a society, and the time when the bank accounts are full, the barn's full. It's been a good crop year, or we've had a good year in sales, had a good bonus, and our checking account's full, savings account's full, market's had a pretty good year on the market in our funds this year. and everything else. And we go to keep the feast, and rightfully so. But the lesson to learn is that at any point in time, and especially during the festival period, when we might think we have a lot, to not get arrogant and forget God. God's given what we have, small or great. God's given it. It comes from Him, which is why don't be proud. Don't let arrogance come from your mouth. Hopefully words of humility and sincerity, truth will come. At the end of verse 3 it says, by Him all actions are weighed. By Him all actions are weighed. It is a time of judgment. It is a time of judgment. Certainly the Feast of Trumpets shows that period of judgment that Christ will bring upon all the nations. But God's actions are sure, and He keeps the account. We may have a time of abundance, but we should not forget God and forget that God gives it to us. Verse 4 begins a series of contrasts that run for several verses here. Ups and downs, highs and lows, successes and reversals that Hannah pours out because she's been up, she's been down, and she's been up. She's seen it from both ends. Verse 4, she says, the bows of the mighty men are broken. The bows are strong at one point. They're together, ready to have an arrow fitted to them. The next minute, it's broken. Nothing more useless than a broken bow. Can't shoot a deer with a broken bow. Can't hit a target with a broken bow. A mighty man might have it in hand at one point, and then before you know it, it's broken, and he's defenseless. And those who stumbled are girded with strength. You ever made a mistake? Made a big mistake, had it pointed out to you, but then see yourself turn around a week later, get a bit of praise, get a commendation. You can be down, you can be up. Verse 5, those who were full have hired themselves out for bread. Full bank account 1 month, looking for a morsel of bread the next, hiring out for bread the next. The hungry have ceased to hunger. Down and then up. The barren has borne 7. And she who has many children has become feeble. Maybe she had in mind her friend Peninnah there in the household, who had many, and what her story became, and now Hannah, who had been barren, had children, had one, and she went on to have more. She knew knew she could have more there. Verse 6, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave, and He brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up. So here is a period of contrasts that goes on here. He raises the poor from the dust, and He lifts the beggar from the ash heap to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. No matter where we might find ourselves this year, let's be tempered in that it could be different next year. Not that we need to live in fear of that, but we all know that we don't know, do we? What the next year will bring. I'm praying for people this year in a different way than I was praying for them last year. This year I'm praying for their life. That God would extend their life. Kind of do like what He did with Hezekiah. Give them a few more years. Wasn't doing that a year ago in some cases. Maybe next year, who knows what we'll bring. This list of reversals and ups and downs. Are you up now? You got the title? You got the name on the door? You've got the position? Good. Use it well. Don't get proud. Don't get arrogant. You might be down. It can be taken away. The business could go out. The company could fold. New management comes in. Circumstances beyond your control take place. Time goes on. You're up, you're down. As the saying goes, be kind to the people on your way up who are on their way down, because if you stay around long enough, you're going to be going down and they're going to be coming back up. That is true. That is true. Treat people with respect. Treat people with kindness and love no matter where they serve, in the office, in the building, in the company, in the church. Do what you can do. Take out that can of trash if it's full. Pick up the trash on the floor if it's right there by you. Teach the class, give the sermonette, lead the songs. Do whatever you're given to do, but do it and rejoice, and do it in the fear of God. Because there's going to be somebody else next year, or in 5 years from now. Be nice to them. This and many other points are right here, and these are some big lessons for us to remember as we go to the feast, and as we come before God, and we rejoice and we fellowship. Because God doesn't change. He goes on here in verse 9, or verse 8, the latter part, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. God's creation on this earth is sound and firm. The sun rises and sets. The conditions of life are exact, and they're not going to change. Now, hurricanes can come up, earthquakes can rumble, and catastrophes can come out of nature. That can be pretty rough. But the earth still stands. Hurricanes and winds can batter our lives, but God's purpose still stands. God's plan still stands. It will not be moved. The pillars of the earth are God's, are the Lord's. Verse 9, he will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength no man shall prevail. By strength no man shall prevail. At another time in the Bible, in Zechariah, I believe it's chapter 4 and verse 6, God's going to say, it's not by strength or might, but by my power, thus says the Lord. And so, when we're young, when we're strong, when we think we're on top, when we think we got it all figured out, just realize that it's not by our strength. It is by God's strength. And that's a good lesson as we prepare to keep the fall festivals, and especially the Feast of Tabernacles. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. We live and move and work in God's strength, not our own. And Hannah learned this, and so should we. That it's not our strength that has gotten us to this point in life. And if we can always remember that, we will do well. And we will be able then to deal with whatever comes our way. It's unexpected, beyond our control, and yet God still stands and his purpose in our lives still stand. And regardless of where we go for the feast and what type of arrangements we have made for this year's Feast of Tabernacles, as we go before God, food, fellowship, and faith, the fear of God, help us to finally and fully rejoice before God. And come to God in a time of peace, when we can do as God commands us to do, and as we will do. I'm going to go back to the story that I told you at the beginning of John C., the fiery preacher of Antioch, who wanted to drive his people out, who wanted to keep the festivals. It's a remarkable story of a period of time. And it might not seem to relate to us today, and by God's grace it doesn't, because you and I can go to Panama City Beach and Mexico and Guatemala and Prince Edward Island and wherever we may go, or if it's just a holiday in Eastgate, and keep the feast and worship God in peace. And let's thank God that we can for another year. The world is changing in many ways. There are people who don't believe as we do, and yet they're exposed on mountaintops in Iraq. And there are people who are Jews who we could have a bit more of an affinity with in some ways, perhaps, that found their synagogues torched in Germany in recent weeks because of rising anti-Semitism in that part of the world. And it hasn't come to our shores exactly in that same way, and for that we give God the thanks. But a story like that should give us pause to consider what we do have, to give God thanks for what we have, and wherever and however we come before Him this year, in the place where He's placed His name. Let's go and let's rejoice. And let's always remember why we're able to be there. And let's learn to fear God. And let's have the best feast ever.